Well, the first thing I think it will be important for us to get in front of us is what are the four committees that are required by the discipline that every church have? Okay, so everybody knows this, I know, but I'm not going to assume. So the first is the finance committee. You got to have a finance committee. You have to have a staff parish relations committee. Or pastor parish relations committee. You have something to deal with the pastor, personnel, whatever. The trustees, and then I'll define these or give the job descriptions as we came to understand them. And then the last is the nominating committee. Okay. So, according to the discipline, at least, the finance committee's job is to deal with all things related to money. So that doesn't just mean approving the pastor's salary or approving the church's budget. The finance committee is charged, according to the discipline, with generating the resources, accounting for the resources, distributing the resources, and auditing the financial process. So all four of those tasks are a part of the finance committee's work. Okay? The staff parish is basically the HR committee, if you want to use a secular term. It deals with all things related to personnel. Now, in a very small church, when there's one personnel, and when you have a pastor, it may not even be full-time, maybe less than full-time, whatever, their job is pretty narrowly defined. And in most churches, I think the staff parish committee feels like they're the complaint department. So they take all the complaints from everybody in the church and they pass on that good news to the pastor, whoever that happens to be. And we talk about it at Cabinet quite often that's not the job of the pastor. Their job is to also encourage the pastor and support the pastor and in many ways act like what was David? David had these men that were sort of around him. David's champions. I think that's what it was called in the Old Testament. In many ways, the staff parish committee needs to be like the pastor's champions. That they're sort of a buffer from between the pastor and the congregation. Yeah, they bring concerns. They get all that, but they also function as a bit of a protection around the pastor. Don't
you think? I think a number of them see their job as trying to rein in the pastor. Instead of trying to build them up. I mean, your church will never rise any higher than the pastor. So it's in your best interest to build them up as much as you can.
Exactly. So. Yeah. I hope that there are churches that can rise above where I can lead them. But I think there's some truth to what you said, that part of their job is to encourage the pastor. In this single board governance, the staff parish's role needs to transition from just being about personnel to also, because what gets lost in the single board governance from the old council on ministries, for instance, is who's doing the planning, who's doing the visioning for this and so the staff parish committee in our model assisted the pastor to do that. Why? Because the pastor most directly relates to this committee out of these four. Okay, so obviously when you're having a pastoral transition or when you're hiring new staff, then the staff parish has got more work to do. Okay, but otherwise, I think support and encouragement of the pastor, and then visioning and planning for programs. The more staff you have, the less this administrative structure, whatever you call it, the single board, the more staff you have, the less planning and programming this group does. It's just natural. Okay, the staff just does more and more of it. So the trustees relate to all things property. So they're in charge of physical property, church buildings, parsonages, land, and the things inside the building. So equipment, property, all that kind of stuff. So that can be everything from technology stuff to shingles to copying machines, whatever. Everything related to property or equipment the trustees have to do
with it.
and the insurance that goes with it. Obviously, the insurance, the finance and the trustees work together on the insurance kind of stuff, but yeah. And then the last, the one that's kind of most often overlooked, I think, is the nominating committee. And so this is kind of how, these are the four that are required by the discipline. I'll stop right there and see if you have any other questions, Jeff, about.
So what would you do about CCYM, or wait, not CCYM, whatever, the youth ministry,
Yeah. Youth ministry.
and the children's, and the worship committee, and the missions committee, and the memorials committee, and the whatever else committee, hospitality, outreach committee.
Yeah, you can have any of those that you want that have a job, that have a very direct purpose. And in churches that don't have a lot of staff, it's very important to have somebody that's leading those. But literally, they can be committees of one. Committees of one get a lot more stuff done than committees of 10.
Yeah.
Just as a rule. The other thing that's different is these are the only four, or actually only three in our model, that are mandated to have the 3-year tenure. You have to, the 3-year rotation. The others, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me just practically. If you've got somebody that has a heart for missions, that served on the missions committee, that they can only do it 3 years, and then you got to put them on finance, or you got to put them someplace else. If you're not on one of these 3 or 4 committees, then you should be able to do that the rest of your life, or as long as you feel like that's what God's called you to serve, and not constricted or restricted by what the discipline says that these have to be on a 3-year rotation. So you can have any of those that you want to, any of those that make sense in your system. There's some that are, like for instance, that you mentioned the memorial committee. That could be a task force or a single person from the finance committee that carries that profile and has a task force that's beyond the finance committee. So they don't all have to show up at the monthly meeting. They just have a representative that brings their report to the monthly meeting. Does that make sense?
Well, yep. And what I saw, at least in Legacy, when Betty was serving with the kids, and it was the main volunteers that just automatically became part of the committee, and they met to do the planning.
Exactly.
And it was there was no nominations, no formality to it, really.
No.
It was
right. And this, in our system, this group is the only ones that appear on the charge conference nominating report.
Okay.
So the worship committee and the hospitality committee and the children's committee and the youth ministry, they recruit their own leadership.
Yeah.
No, the nominating committee doesn't do any of that other recruiting. And my point always...
I think I remember you saying back under the old system, there was the Christian Ed Committee, and none of those were actually teachers.
None of them were teachers.
So why are they deciding? Anyway, it was just interesting.
Well, it's very interesting.
It could get messed up in the old system. Yeah.
Yes, and you can see that. That was just one example. You could see it in a number of different ways. That the back in the old system, the worship committee or the evangelism. Let's use that. The evangelism committee had a terrible time recruiting people to be on, and so they wanted the nominating committee to do their work for them, which makes no sense. You've got nominating people, and the people on a nominating committee that meet once a year in the old system, they don't know who people are that have a passion for evangelism. Yeah. And furthermore, what you find out is that some of these committees don't understand their purpose. The evangelism committee back in the day was, well, let's decide which flavor of Kool-Aid we're going to serve for coffee and cookies after church. That's not evangelism. I'm sorry. So I think by allowing people to sort of organize themselves and recruit their own folks, you figure out stuff that you're doing that's not really that important. Yeah. I've often believed that one of the great advantages of churches not having a pastor for a while is they soon have to figure out what's really important and what's not. Everything is important if somebody else has to do it, right? Yep. And somebody else is almost always the preacher, right? Yep. That's what that usually means. Okay. So anyway, where are we at? Let's get back on track.
Okay. So you got it as these 4 main groups, or 3 main groups at least. So yep. Now, how does that all come together under one single board?
Okay. So in our system, we had, each of these had four people on them. Okay? For a total of 12. So there are 12 people. I'm not very good in math, so correct me, Jeff. I know that's your world. But there were 4 people on each of these committees that were designated as, specifically, maybe they were even recruited to be finance people or staff parish people. Maybe they were in HR someplace or whatever. Or trustees, people that liked working with their hands and liked physical kind of projects. And so what you can see from this immediately, if you put these people on a 3-year rotation, is that every year you're going to have one of these groups is going to have 2 new elections, and the other 2 are going to have 1. You understand that? Yeah.
Yep.
So you have to class these 3 groups. So you got class of 2019, 2020, 2021, or whatever it is, as you're recruiting them out. And so the other thing that I would say that worked for us, now I think they're doing it a little bit different now under Brandon, but when we first started this, we had everybody all meet together, and the meetings were long 3-hour meetings we'd have. We talked about everything under the sun, and you do get better as you keep going. You refine the process. But a story happened at our first meeting, the January after we approved this at Church Conference in December, and we implemented it in January, and I went to the meeting, and I'm kind of giving all the covenants and all the expectations, and, you better talk here, and whatever you say here stays here. It's confidentiality. No meetings in the parking lot after the meeting. That was a part of our former history in this place, and stuff like that. And I talked about the fact that we had to speak our minds and speak our piece. But when a decision was made, we tried to do everything by consensus in the early days, which is part of the reason the meetings were too long. But I said, when we get done, when we make a decision and we walk out of this room, we made this decision. Nobody goes out of this room and said, well, they voted, I voted against it, but they voted to do this or that or the other thing. We were always going to be in unity about whatever the decision was, even if we were not in favor of it personally. So those were some of the guiding principles that we tried to instill. Anyway, I'm going through my long list of all these different rules and constrictions, and Clarence Wall, do you remember Clarence Wall? Clarence was on the trustees. Now, when we instituted this, I asked 2 people from the former finance staff parish and trustees to bridge, to go over into the new system, okay? And then I recruited 2 new people to be on the ballot that were elected. So we had some history, some carryover. Well, Clarence was one of the trustees, and Warren was on the finance committee. So at this meeting, I'm doing my spiel, and Clarence goes, I don't really care about all that stuff. He's a typical trustee. I just know that the back door on this, in the middle of the winter, and the back door on this doesn't lock and doesn't shut and it doesn't lock. And I want to know, Warren, do we have enough money left over from last year to fix that door? And he goes, well, yeah. He said, I think we've got, about $3,500. What do you think it'll cost? Well, about $2,500. And Clarence says, all right, I'll get it done today or this week. And I just stopped him. I said, what happened just right there in that 2-minute conversation would normally have taken 3 months in the old system.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So the trustees had to go and they'd have to get the cost, they'd have to get an estimate, they'd have to get different bids, they'd have to bring those back, the administrative board would have to approve the bids, then they would decide if the next month that they'd present it to the finance, they'd have to decide whether they had the money to do it. Finally, it would come to the administrative board the next month, and 3 months later, it's now nice, and the ground stopped heaving and the door works fine.
Yeah.
We don't need it fixed. So the point is, it becomes so much more efficient and effective to have all of the major voices in the room at the same time doing the same thing.
Totally.
So,
I was working with a church that was trying to sell their parsonages, and the finance committee approved it in a separate meeting. The SBRC committee approved it. The trustees approved it. And then the chairs of each one met with me to decide who else needs to approve it. I said, I think you guys got it covered. So
you got it covered.
So
let's sell this thing.
Bring it to the church conference, of course. But anyway,
we're having a church conference on Sunday. Say that again.
What? Yeah, they just had to bring it to the charge conference.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how under the old system, it's hard to know when a decision is made for real.
Right. Yeah, you have kind of for lack of a better term, you have a fuzzy understanding of where the buck stops. In many churches, the trustees rule. They're the last line of defense in many churches. In other churches, it's the finance committee. Yeah. If we don't have the money, it ain't going to happen. And whether or not we have the money is based on the accountant that's reporting and projecting whether or not we're going to have enough money as we go forward. And so the staff parish hardly ever wins that. And in the old system, you would have all of these committees plus, like I said, a council on ministries or an administrative board. And so there's the confusion. This is the administrative team. That's what we call it here at Legacy. It could be the lead team or the leadership team or the whatever you want to call it. But in our case, the administrative team, or short ad team, that's how we kind of use it, because that was their job, to do the business of the church in the most Christ-like manner. Okay? So I think a key component. Yeah, go ahead.
I really don't want people to miss that, is you get all these people finally talking together. And I mean, we had some tough conversations because you were talking property or staff and finances, all because those three things intersect so much, but you had to have the tough conversations in the same room together.
Yeah. So this is how we started, Jeff. We started with all of those 12 people, plus me as ex officio, voice and no vote. We also had the treasurer of the church, which was you for a time, on that committee, came to this lead team, voice but no vote. We also elected, or we asked a person from the congregation. Actually, we had a volunteer person from the congregation who wanted to be the secretary. And she was the secretary for over 15 years, just because she wanted to know what was going on in the church. Yeah. She was wonderful. She hardly ever spoke, but she was always there, and she took wonderful notes. And the longer she was there, the more vocal she became, which was great. And people welcomed it and loved it. So a couple of practical things related to this. So we started with the whole team at the whole meeting, and we had, like I said, we had some long 3+ hour meetings. So what we decided after the first year of living with this was, let's divide our evening and have these groups meet in what we called sub-teams. So at 6:30, the finance meeting, the finance four would go to a corner of the church, and they would talk about finance stuff. The staff parish typically would meet in my office around the conference table, and I would meet with them. Now, if the finance needed me for something, I'd go meet with them, but otherwise I was almost always with the staff parish team. I represented the staff to that team. The staff they were welcome to come, but there was no obligation to come, because many of the staff were part-time, and you don't want them using their part-time going to a meeting, for heaven's sakes. Yep. The trustees would go meet in whatever corner of the building was leaking at that particular time, or wherever the furnace was blown up. They would meet wherever there was a problem, and if there wasn't a problem, they would just meet wherever. So our meetings would start at 6:30 and go till 7:30. The first hour was all separate, and from that hour, then the finance would only bring to the larger team would all 12 of these people would meet then at 7:30, and we would hear from the finance, well, these are the issues that we're dealing with at the finance committee, just boom, 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 but this is something we need action on. We all need to vote on this or that. And they were usually last, because their actions were oftentimes related to what some of these other things might need, okay? So that sub-team, full team meeting thing helped us a lot. So what you found out was, let's say, for instance, the easiest to think about, well, not really, is trustees. So let's say you're dealing with a roofing issue, okay? And many times in the small churches, the trustees do all the work. Yeah. They do all the physical work. And most of them are older and they can't do it. And so what the trustees really need to become are, if they can't do the work physically, they got to find the persons to do the work. Yeah. And so a lot of times when the trustees would come to their 6:30 sub-team meeting, they might have 6 or 8 or 7 people, however many people were there related to whatever projects they were working on. Yeah. Okay? And so they would come to the sub-team meeting, give their report. This is the update on what we're doing on the roof or the windows or whatever. But then they wouldn't go to the big team meeting.
Yeah.
Just the 4 people who were elected would go. Same thing for
I thought
staff
that was
parish.
the most interesting thing because people would serve on the trustees, and then if they, you know, they would still want to hang around and be part of the projects. There, you get all the benefit of being able to do the work, making the church a better
Yep.
place, but you don't have to sit through a meeting.
For another 2-hour or another hour meeting or whatever.
Yep.
So no,
Yep.
we called these the task forces. So for instance, when we're hiring a new worship director, okay, it doesn't make sense to have a trustee sit on the interview committee to hire a worship director. I mean, they like worship probably, mostly, hopefully, but or a children's pastor. If you're going to hire a new children's pastor, you would have these 4 people, but then you'd probably get some parents of people that have kids that age. They would be on the interview team. And so this sub-team of the staff parish may relate to, all right, we've posted the job description, we've got 20 applicants. How are we going to pare these down? So instead of just these 4 people doing that, they might have the other 4, the others that make up the 8-person interview team. And so they would do that work in a sub-team, and then this team would bring the report to the larger team. And at some point, they would come and say, the interview team has interviewed the top 3 candidates, and we'd like to make a recommendation to hire Joe or Jane. And they would say, what does the rest of the team feel about that? The first, well, what are you going to pay him? Trustees are going to say, what space are they going to need? What kind of stuff like that? But they could make the decision all at one time. So that sub-team, full team division really helped us. Today, I think Legacy is doing, I think they meet separately for the whole evening. So I think the sub-teams meet 1 week,
Okay.
and then 2 weeks later, the whole team meets. Which it seems to be working for them. That was their choice. I liked having all the meetings on one night. Because back when we did this, our boys were still at home, and I just didn't want to be gone any more nights than I had to be. And so we did it all in one night, made it a long night, obviously. But I think now they're doing it every other week, and they're doing the sub-teams 1 week, and then the whole team 2 weeks later. So I think that's the model they're using now. So yeah.
And again,
How am I doing?
when I remember doing it, the vast majority of time you had close to 100% attendance, of those 12 people.
We really did. The gift of administration is one of the spiritual gifts.
Yeah.
And I believe in 12 is not a magic number. It's a biblical number. It's not a magic number. Yeah. You could have 6. You could have 2 in each of these 2. 3 would be a little, that might be pressing it a little bit, but 12 is not a magic number. Some could have 15. It doesn't really, that doesn't really matter. 9 is, a very functional number, 3 people on each team. But I think that in every church you can find people that have this gift that are willing to serve in this capacity. At least we did, and it worked pretty well. So let me address, go ahead.
Go. I'll let you go, and then I got a question afterwards. So.
Okay. I was going to just talk about this team also elected its own chairperson. And so actually, after the first year, when the first year happened, we elected a chairperson and we elected a vice chairperson, with the understanding that the vice chair would serve in absence of the chair and that the vice chair would become the chair the next year. So the second year and every year after, you're only electing a vice chair. You never again elect a chair. I mean, you're always electing a vice chair who, what the assumption is. And so a lot of times people ask me, how did you know and I said, you know what? Through the years, we developed this process where of electing leaders, and even to the nominating. I'll walk you through how we did nominations out of this model. Okay. But let's just go back to electing the chairperson. So we'd get together in January with the new team members, and we don't have the new chairperson has assumed responsibility that month. Okay, so now that month we're also going to elect a vice chair. Each of these 3 teams would also elect their own chair.
Yeah.
Okay. So they would be the ones that would bring the report from the whole group or from the sub-team to the whole group. So I would just simply say, all right, we're going to elect our chairperson today. So here's what I'd like you to do. We're going to pray, and I believe God is going to lay it on somebody's heart to be the chairperson next year, to be the vice chair this year and the chairperson next year. And so just listen as we pray. And if God lays it on your heart, then you just have to say so. You just have to say. And if not, then we'll do a nominating process. We'll take nominations and we'll have an election. And I believe that in my 20 years here, 18 years of doing it this way, we had one election. Otherwise, almost every year, we'd get done praying, we'd have some quiet, we'd get done, and somebody'd say, I feel like maybe God is calling me to do this. And you know how that works. And everybody'd say, now I vote, nomination cease. That's how they would respond. That's, they don't want to do it or whatever. But the most interesting was one year I'd recruited a young guy who was a trustee. He works for an HVAC company. High school grad, great guy, wonderful father, great husband, very active in our church, grew up in the church in Steele and came here. Anyway, I don't think he would have been on anybody's radar to be the chairperson. But we got done praying and nobody said anything. And I was almost to the point of saying, well, we better take some nominations then. And Dustin raised his hand. He said, I think God's asking me to be the chairperson, if you think that would be okay, or if you all think that. Everybody's like, you'd be great. And he was absolutely a great leader.
Well, and that's the thing I noticed too. I guess I never paid attention close enough, but some of the leaders, it seemed like they were the right person at the right time. I remember Dave being the chairperson one year. It was kind of contentious, and he was the calming presence. I mean, that's how the Lord used him. So it was, It's exactly
right. Everybody knows Jane Hinks. She's become a rock star in the conference. And when I invited her to come to be on the ballot, to be elected, she was so scared and so felt unworthy and all this and that and whatever. And 2 years later, she felt God calling her to be the chair of the board, chair of the leadership team, and she did great. And so anyway, I think you're right. Okay, you were going to ask a question.
All right. So about the agenda. So does it only come from these committees, or who actually sets the agenda when the whole ad team or single board gets together?
Yep. It can be any other agenda, but it comes out of these three groups. So if there's somebody in the congregation that has a complaint about the pastor, for instance, the staff parish committee would deal with that internally in their sub-team. If they really felt like there was something that needed to come to the whole board, they would bring it. Otherwise, it never got there.
Okay.
It just never did. Same with the trustees. If the majority of the things that got on the agenda required additional funding from the finance committee. So for instance, if trustees have a $50,000 budget, I'm just using that figure, and they need to buy new silverware for the kitchen, and that doesn't take them over budget, then they have authority to just buy it. They don't have to come back and get permission again to spend the budget that's already been approved. Make sense? But let's just say that we need to put in new windows, and it's going to cost $51,000, and they've only got $50,000 budgeted. So then they would come back to the team and say, well, we're going to get new windows. It's going to cost more than we thought. Do we or can we spend $1,000 more than what we had budgeted for this project? So that was the majority part of the agenda. And, in the early days, we would we went every direct. We were talking about all kinds of nonsense we didn't need to and didn't years later. It just gets pared down as you figure out how to function and how to work. So how does a person from the congregation get an issue before the board or before the ad team? The names of these 12 people are published. I don't know that they're published every week, but they're published often. They're put on the screen. They're most of our official communication stuff. So if people want to know who they are, they know that's their connection to the administration team. We tried to practice permission giving, stuff. And so we would kind of say to the general population, look, if you have a ministry idea that you think is that this church ought to do or be in support of, if you can find somebody else to help you, first you got to convince one person at least, then the two of you just go do it.
Yeah.
And if you need money, then write a proposal and bring it to the ad team. So the budgeting process, the money trail was the primary way that people got access to the administrative team. And we made that a very public process. It started in August every year. So every person, every group in the church that got money out of the church budget, in August, you did this. You would send them a report. This is what your budget was last year. If you don't have an increase, you don't even need to make a report to the finance committee. If you just want the same amount of money, you're good to go. We're good with that. We may come back to you, and some years we had to do this, and say, we need to have you reduce your budget by 5% or 3% or whatever. Yeah. You figure out how to, it's up to you. We're not going to arbitrarily do that. You figure it out, tell us how you're going to eliminate 5%. If you want an increase, then you need to justify to the ad team why you need that increase. Yep. And each of these cities would do that related to, whatever. If it was a new ministry, for instance, that needed money to do some kind of new ministry, they would write their proposal. If it didn't fit any one of these things, they would bring it to me. And they'd say, we want to do this ministry. It's going to cost this much money. Will you bring it to the ad team? I'd start with the staff parish usually, but that's how it would get there. Now today, at least at Legacy, it's much more people driven. It's just, I'll give you an example. We have one of the ladies from the church that has a home in Florida, and when she's there, she and her husband attend George Acevedo's church in Fort Myers. They do this Shoes of Hope thing, where they buy brand new tennis shoes and they give them away to kids in a local school. And so Anita was down there this past winter, a year ago, and saw this and was a part of that program. She came back to church. I'm gone. She goes to Brandon and says, Brandon, we're doing this. This is good, and we're doing this. And Brandon goes, that's great. You're going to lead it. And she goes, oh, I don't know if I can lead it. And he goes, if you believe it needs to get done, you're going to have to lead it. We'll help you get people. We'll help you raise money, but you have to lead it. You have to do it. So she said, okay, I'll do it. And so immediately she went and found 2 or 3 other people from the church. She works in the kitchen primarily. So she got some of those kitchen folks to help her, guys and gals, and they planned it, and they recruited people from their other circles of influence outside the church. So this year they did this program. They gave away 150 pairs of shoes. They had 100 volunteers from the church and the community that worked at that, and it was a phenomenal success. That never got stuck here. It never even happened.
Do you think that would have happened, or what the likelihood of that would happening if it would have been dependent on the missions committee or the outreach committee or whatever it is?
We would have committed it to death.
Yep.
We would have determined at some point we couldn't get enough volunteers, or we wouldn't be able to raise enough money, and so we wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so in this modern, newer iteration, we don't ever let it give. If it's a good idea, if it's a God idea, and you can find somebody to agree to help you, then let us know how we can help you raise the money. And it's a fairly costly thing. I mean, it was $10,000 or more to buy all those shoes. They buy new shoes. So.
When I think of it, I mean, the Holy Spirit is like the gas. I mean, on the ministry, and I'm pushing people. But I want to say this administrative structure is like the brake and the steering wheel. Because without a brake or a steering wheel, you're not going to get where you want to go. I mean, they help guide, they make sure it is. So that's kind of how I see it.